You think you know what the VA is. You see the buildings, you hear the promises, you read the headlines about benefits, and maybe, just maybe, you believe that when the uniform comes off, the safety net catches you. You believe that the nation you risked everything for will be there to heal your body and mend your mind. That is the lie. That is the initial heartbreaking deception that every single veteran buys into, only to have it systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. This isn't a story about bureaucratic inefficiency. This is a true account of institutional betrayal, a slow, calculated erosion of trust that leaves those who served feeling utterly abandoned, fighting a war at home against the very system designed to protect them. You are about to hear the story of Alex, a veteran whose life became a relentless, decade-long battle with the Department of Veterans Affairs, a fight so draining, so dehumanizing, that by the end he didn't just distrust the VA, he fundamentally questioned the value of his sacrifice. And once you see the patterns, once you understand the machinery of denial, you will realize this isn't just Alex's story. It is the untold truth of millions, and you will never look at that sprawling, complex agency the same way again. The groundwork for this profound mistrust is laid not when the veteran is injured, but when they are recruited. We start with the pristine image, the glossy brochures, the persuasive words of the recruiter detailing not just the adventure, the honor, and the duty, but the guaranteed future, the GI Bill, the home loans, and the comprehensive health care for life. This is the initial covenant, the unbreakable promise whispered in the ear of a young, idealistic American. Serve your country faithfully, and your country will care for you faithfully forever. Alex, like so many others, internalized this contract. He believed that the benefits were not a handout, but a solemn obligation, a return on the most valuable investment a citizen can make, their physical and mental well-being. He served with distinction, facing situations that most civilians cannot even fathom, coming home fundamentally changed, carrying invisible scars alongside the physical ones. But the moment his boots hit civilian ground for the last time, the narrative shifted from one of honored commitment to one of adversarial skepticism. The transition process, meant to be a welcoming bridge, felt instantly like being pushed off a cliff. The required Transition Assistance Program, or TAP, was a rushed, sterile series of briefings where the VA representative, often clearly reading from outdated slides, spoke in terms of eligibility and limitations, using language designed to obscure access rather than facilitate it. The overwhelming sense was not, "Welcome home, let us help," but rather, "Here is the gauntlet you must run if you dare to ask for the things we promised." The initial shock was realizing that the VA, this massive, federally funded entity, didn't view him as a valued former employee or a national hero, but as an application number, a potential liability, a cost center that needed to be minimized. This realization that the institution's primary function appeared to be managing claims, not maximizing care, was the first tremor beneath the foundation of his trust, a subtle but insidious signal that the promise had been conditional, perhaps even fraudulent, from the start. This initial dissonance between the patriotic rhetoric of service and the cold, bureaucratic reality of separation is the first crucial step in the journey toward utter loss of faith, a moment where the veteran realizes they have moved from being an asset to being a burden. And the weight of that realization is crushing, setting the stage for the years of fighting ahead. The depth of this initial letdown is often underestimated by those who haven't lived it. It's the moment the hero narrative evaporates, replaced by the stark, unrelenting truth of institutional indifference, a truth that echoes in every subsequent interaction with the very system sworn to protect their future. The second stage of betrayal, and perhaps the most immediately overwhelming, is the wall of paperwork, the sheer crushing weight of bureaucracy designed, it seems, to induce surrender through exhaustion. Alex needed to file claims for service-connected disabilities, chronic back pain from repeated heavy lifting in theater, persistent tinnitus, and the creeping, isolating dread of post-traumatic stress. The process was not straightforward. It was a labyrinthine maze of forms, acronyms, and requirements that demanded the veteran effectively become their own medical and legal expert overnight. He was told he needed a nexus, a professional medical opinion directly linking his current condition to a specific event or period during his service. This sounds logical until you realize that the military often minimizes or outright ignores injuries while you are actively serving, meaning those crucial records, the documentation of the initial injury, simply do not exist or are buried deep within archives, requiring months, sometimes years, to retrieve. Alex spent 6 months just gathering the initial evidence, sifting through thousands of pages of medical records, deployment logs, and personal journals, trying to construct a perfect, undeniable case against an institution that already possessed all the information. The forms themselves were a masterpiece of obfuscation, requiring specific esoteric details that a layman could not possibly know without professional legal assistance that the VA does not readily provide or encourage. He had to learn the difference between a statement in support of claim, SSC, and a notice of disagreement, NOD, the various forms of appeals, supplemental claim, higher-level review, board appeal, and the specific language required to trigger the correct response. This mountain of administrative burden created an immediate, profound sense of psychological warfare. It felt less like an application for earned benefits and more like an interrogation designed to catch him in a technical error. Every denial letter, often terse and vaguely worded, required him to start the entire, grueling process over, forcing him to dedicate hours every week to fighting the system instead of focusing on recovery or rebuilding his civilian life. This administrative burden is a deliberate attrition strategy. The VA knows that many veterans, especially those struggling with mental health issues or debilitating physical pain, will simply give up, unable to withstand the emotional and intellectual toll of constant bureaucratic combat. This is the point where veterans realize the VA isn't just slow, it is actively, aggressively complicated, forcing the disabled to expend precious, limited energy on administrative tasks instead of healing, cementing the second pillar of absolute mistrust. The system is designed to deny, not to serve. The sheer volume of documentation required to prove an injury that occurred while serving the nation is an insult, a profound disrespect to the commitment made, transforming the act of seeking care into a secondary, almost impossible mission that often overshadows the primary goal of physical and mental recovery, leaving the veteran perpetually trapped in a cycle of filing, waiting, and despairing. The exhaustion derived from this paper war is a silent killer, sapping the will to fight and leading many to conclude that the cost of pursuing their rightful benefits outweighs the potential reward, a tragic calculation forced upon them by institutional design. The third stage, the medical maze, is where the stakes become truly life and death, and where the institutional failure transitions from frustrating bureaucracy to outright negligence. After months of waiting, Alex was scheduled for his compensation and pension C&P examinations, the crucial appointments where VA-contracted doctors determine the severity and service connection of his claimed conditions. These exams were supposed to be comprehensive assessments, but they often felt like brief, rushed interrogations. For his back pain, the doctor spent less than 5 minutes measuring his range of motion, barely touching him, and seemed more interested in typing notes into the computer than listening to Alex describe the daily agonizing stiffness. For his PTSD claim, the examiner, a general practitioner with no specialized trauma training, asked a handful of standardized checklist questions, dismissing Alex's detailed accounts of nightmares and hypervigilance, with a shrug and a notation of malingering potential. The immediate visceral feeling was one of profound dismissal. The medical professionals hired by the VA often appeared to prioritize cost containment and minimizing liability over accurate diagnosis and compassionate care. The veteran felt like an antagonist in their own healthcare narrative, constantly having to exaggerate symptoms just to be taken seriously, or conversely, having to fight back against the examiner's inherent skepticism. When Alex finally received his initial rating decision, several conditions were either rated far too low or outright denied, based on C&P exams that he felt were deliberately superficial or even falsified. This forced him into the cycle of seeking private medical opinions, expensive independent medical examinations, IMEs, just to contradict the VA's own doctors. He had to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket to prove that the injuries he sustained while serving were, in fact, real and debilitating. The VA system also failed fundamentally in its delivery of ongoing medical care. Wait times for specialists were legendary. Months for a dermatologist, half a year for a pain management clinic, often leading Alex to seek emergency care for manageable conditions because the system couldn't schedule him in a timely manner. The crucial concept of continuity of care was non-existent. He rarely saw the same primary care provider twice, forcing him to re-explain his complex history, his medications, and his current symptoms to a rotating cast of often visibly overworked and burned-out staff. This relentless inconsistency and the feeling that his pain was being actively doubted by the very people sworn to heal him created a deep, festering wound of mistrust. It wasn't just poor service, it was a systemic pattern of neglect that actively delayed healing and prolonged suffering, convincing Alex that the VA's medical wing was designed to run down the clock on his life rather than restore his health. The agonizing realization that the institution valued bureaucratic efficiency over human suffering, consistently prioritizing the minimization of expenditure over the maximization of well-being, transformed his view of the VA from a potential savior into a tangible threat to his long-term health and survival, a devastating understanding that permeates every subsequent interaction and decision he makes regarding his care. The erosion of medical trust is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the VA's failure, as it forces veterans into a position of self-advocacy and self-diagnosis, often delaying crucial treatment out of fear of the system's inherent incompetence or bias, leading to preventable deterioration and, tragically often, irreversible outcomes. The fourth stage, the financial fight, is the protracted, soul-crushing war over compensation and the arbitrary, maddening inconsistency of the rating system. The VA disability rating is the financial lifeline for many veterans, directly impacting their ability to live, work, and support their families. For Alex, his initial rating was shockingly low, a meager percentage that barely covered his monthly prescription costs, let alone his inability to hold a consistent full-time job due to his chronic pain and mental health struggles. The rating system, based on a complex and often outdated schedule for rating disabilities, felt less like a medical assessment and more like a cruel lottery. Two veterans with identical injuries might receive vastly different ratings based solely on which C&P examiner they saw, or which regional office processed their claim. Alex learned quickly that the VA often employs the low-ball strategy, issuing an initial denial or a minimal rating, knowing that the appeal process is so lengthy and complex that many will accept the insufficient amount out of desperation. This initiated the multi-year appeal cycle. He filed a Notice of Disagreement, NO'd, which led to a higher-level review, HLR, which resulted in a duty to assist error finding, meaning the VA admitted they failed to gather the required evidence but still didn't grant the claim, simply kicking the can down the road. This procedural merry-go-round, designed to consume time and energy, meant years passed where Alex was living below the poverty line, unable to afford specialized treatment, all while the VA debated whether his wartime-induced injuries qualified for a few $100s more per month. The financial strain was compounded by the psychological toll of constantly having to justify his worth and his pain. He had to prove he was disabled enough to deserve the rating, but not so disabled that he couldn't function enough to attend the mandatory appointments and file the endless appeals. The financial instability resulting from these delays had a devastating ripple effect. He struggled with housing, his marriage suffered under the stress of mounting medical bills, and his sense of self-worth plummeted as he felt perpetually dependent on a system that treated him like a beggar. The realization here is stark. The VA isn't just slow to pay, the system appears structurally incentivized to delay payments, effectively using the veteran's financial desperation as leverage to minimize the final payout. This transforms the compensation process into a prolonged, degrading negotiation where the veteran's financial stability is held hostage by bureaucratic inertia, solidifying the belief that the government views their financial obligation not as a debt of honor, but as an expenditure to be ruthlessly minimized regardless of the human cost involved. The sheer injustice of this protracted financial battle often overshadows the physical recovery, forcing the veteran to prioritize solvency over health, a truly unconscionable position for a nation to place its heroes in. The fifth stage, the mental health crisis, exposes the deepest, most agonizing failure of the VA, the inability to adequately address the invisible wounds of service. Alex's persistent PTSD symptoms, the constant vigilance, the explosive anger, the terrifying nightmares, were the most debilitating aspect of his post-service life. He desperately needed consistent, specialized trauma therapy, but accessing it through the VA was a nightmare. The initial assessment, as noted, was dismissive. When he was finally referred to a therapist, the wait list was 6 months long. 6 months of spiraling anxiety, 6 months of isolating himself from family and friends, 6 months living on the brink of collapse. When he finally started therapy, the sessions were often inconsistent, canceled due to staff shortages, or led by providers who rotated out of the system every few months, forcing Alex to re-traumatize himself by recounting his worst experiences to a new stranger repeatedly. This lack of continuity, coupled with the systemic stigma that still permeates the VA, made true healing impossible. The culture within some VA facilities often subtly discourages seeking mental health help, framing it as a weakness or a mechanism for obtaining a higher disability rating rather than a necessary medical intervention. Alex witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of this failure. He knew fellow veterans who reached out for help during a crisis only to be placed on hold, transferred between departments, or told to wait until their next scheduled appointment. The statistics speak the horrifying truth. The rate of veteran suicide is tragically high, a national disgrace driven in part by the VA's systemic failure to provide timely, specialized, and compassionate mental health care during critical moments. When Alex finally hit his breaking point, experiencing a severe panic attack that left him unable to function, he drove himself to the VA emergency room, only to wait 8 hours in a chaotic environment, surrounded by other veterans in distress, before being seen briefly by a physician who simply prescribed a higher dose of anti-anxiety medication and told him to follow up with his primary care provider, the one he couldn't get an appointment with for 3 months. This experience shattered his remaining faith. It wasn't just that the VA was failing to heal him. It felt like the VA was actively contributing to the crisis, leaving him and his peers to manage the overwhelming burden of trauma alone. The realization that the institution responsible for treating the trauma of war was itself becoming a secondary source of trauma through neglect and institutional incompetence is the point of no return for trust, confirming the horrifying suspicion that the VA's response to the invisible wounds of war is fundamentally inadequate, bordering on criminal indifference, a systemic failure that costs lives every single day, a moral stain on the nation's conscience that cannot be easily erased or forgotten. The sixth stage is the systemic cover-up, the terrifying realization that the institution prioritizes self-preservation and reputation management over accountability and veteran well-being. Alex started following VA news and realized his isolated struggles were part of a massive, horrifying pattern. He read about the wait time scandals, where staff manipulated appointment data to meet targets, resulting in veterans dying while waiting for appointments that looked timely on paper. He learned about the culture of retaliation against whistleblowers, VA employees who tried to expose mismanagement, incompetence, or even outright corruption, only to be fired, demoted, or harassed into silence. This wasn't just poor management. This was a deliberate institutional effort to hide failures and evade responsibility. When Alex filed a formal complaint about the conduct of a specific C&P examiner whose report was demonstrably false, the complaint disappeared into the bureaucracy. He received a form letter stating the matter had been reviewed internally with no details, no consequences for the examiner, and no mechanism for true oversight. The message was chillingly clear. The VA protects its own, even when that protection comes at the direct expense of the veterans they are sworn to serve. There is a deeply ingrained culture of impunity within certain segments of the VA bureaucracy, where individuals responsible for gross negligence or malicious delays face no real professional consequences. This lack of accountability transforms the relationship from one of service to one of fear. Veterans hesitate to report poor treatment, fearing retaliation or further delays in their claims. The entire system is structured to absorb criticism without enacting meaningful change, using task forces, internal reviews, and vague promises of improvement as shields against genuine structural reform. Alex realized that fighting the VA wasn't just fighting a claim. It was fighting a deeply entrenched, self-protecting federal bureaucracy that viewed external scrutiny as an annoyance rather than a necessary mechanism for improvement. The discovery of this institutional rot, the deliberate manipulation of data, the silencing of truth-tellers, the pervasive lack of accountability for those who fail veterans, is the moment the veteran shifts from feeling neglected to feeling actively targeted, confirming the suspicion that the system's primary function is not to heal, but to survive, regardless of the human cost, cementing a profound and irreversible mistrust in the integrity of the entire organization. This systemic cover-up is perhaps the most insidious aspect of the VA's failure, as it ensures that the cycle of neglect and denial continues unchecked, perpetuating the suffering of those who deserve the nation's absolute best. The seventh and final stage is the final cost, the devastating psychological toll of the accumulated betrayal, resulting in the complete, irreversible loss of faith. After years of fighting, of filing, appealing, waiting, being dismissed, and being financially strained, Alex secured a slightly higher rating and access to more consistent care. But the victory was hollow. The years spent fighting had fundamentally altered his personality and his outlook on life. The constant adversarial posture required to navigate the VA had left him perpetually cynical, hypervigilant, and exhausted. He no longer trusted any government institution, viewing every promise with deep suspicion. His relationship suffered because the chronic stress of the fight had frayed his nerves and consumed his mental energy. He had spent his most crucial post-service years battling a bureaucracy instead of healing, building a career, or connecting with his family. The cost wasn't just the physical pain or the lost income. It was the loss of his peace of mind, the loss of his idealism, and the loss of the fundamental belief that his sacrifice had been valued. The VA had not just failed to care for him, it had actively harmed him through prolonged stress, delay, and institutional indifference. The most profound realization is that the VA system, in its current form, is a secondary trauma generator. It takes individuals already suffering from the wounds of war and subjects them to a secondary, bureaucratic war that is often just as damaging as the combat they endured overseas. This final painful truth, that the system designed to honor and heal them instead became a source of ongoing pain and despair, is what truly breaks the veteran's spirit. They are left with the chilling knowledge that the nation they served, through its chosen instrument, is not their protector, but their perennial adversary. The trust is not just damaged, it is annihilated, replaced by a deep, protective cynicism that informs every future decision, ensuring that the VA will forever be viewed not as a sanctuary, but as a necessary evil to be navigated with extreme caution, skepticism, and a profound sense of self-preservation. This final stage is the psychological scar that never fades, the enduring legacy of a broken promise, a constant reminder that for too many veterans, coming home meant trading one battlefield for another, equally brutal and unforgiving. The story of Alex, repeated in thousands of variations across the country, is not just an indictment of inefficiency. It is a profound moral failure of the highest order. We have detailed the journey, the broken covenant of the initial promise, the soul-crushing attrition of the wall of paperwork, the life-threatening negligence within the medical maze, the deliberate financial warfare waged through the compensation hell, the devastating indifference to the mental health crisis, and the self-serving malignancy of the systemic cover-up. Each stage strips away another layer of dignity, another shard of hope, until the veteran is left with nothing but the cold, hard realization that they are alone in their fight. The VA, this sprawling, multi-billion-dollar entity, has consistently demonstrated that its priority is institutional survival, financial minimization, and bureaucratic expediency, often achieved at the direct expense of the physical and mental health of the men and women who earned its care. The system is fundamentally broken, designed not for rapid recovery, but for slow, managed denial, forcing veterans to fight for years just to receive the basic necessities they were promised. The real tragedy is not that these failures occur, but that they are systemic, predictable, and stubbornly resistant to genuine reform. So, what is the final takeaway? It is this: never assume that the VA is operating in the veteran's best interest. You must approach every interaction with skepticism, armed with documentation, legal advice, and a relentless commitment to self-advocacy. For those of us on the outside, we must stop accepting the narrative of bureaucratic slip-ups and start demanding immediate, radical accountability for the systemic failures that are costing lives and destroying futures. Alex's story proves that the VA is not a safety net, it is a battlefield. And until that system is fundamentally restructured to prioritize the immediate, comprehensive care of the veteran above all else, the trust will remain irrevocably shattered. We owe them more than gratitude. We owe them the absolute best care our nation can provide, and until that day comes, every veteran who walks through those doors must proceed with the chilling, understanding that they are entering the next, and sometimes the hardest, fight of their lives. Do not let this story be forgotten. Let it be the catalyst for the change our veterans desperately deserve.